Hey, good morning. Welcome to the Cory Morgan Show, Friday, May 14th. It's been a lively political week, and I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about today. My day's going better than Jason Kenney's is, I'm sure, though I do have things easier than he does as well. He's in an unenviable position, that's for sure, and we'll talk and rant a little bit about that as we get going. So a little later on here, I'm going to have Kris Sims. She's the BC director from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. They put out some great stuff on the results of the BC carbon tax, which is the highest in the country. You know, the left coast, they're going to tax us all green. They're going to save the world if we could just charge ourselves enough money to do everything. All the fluffy bunnies will do better and the temperatures will become stable. Apparently, it hasn't been very effective yet, and it's going to be interesting talking to Kris about that and other taxpayer-related issues on the federal and provincial fronts. After that, I'm going to have Lee Harding on as MEC is commenting, I guess, on the YouTube channel there. Lee Harding writes columns for the Western Standard, also for the Epoch Times and a number of other areas. And we'll talk about some of the stuff he's written on. He's written on the carbon tax impacts on agricultural producers. He's out of Saskatchewan, so, I mean, the ag is big in the West and particularly in Saskatchewan, so it'll be great talking to Lee about that. And he also got fined $2,800 for being at an anti-lockdown protest and covering it. He was there as a reporter, not as a protester. Apparently that wasn't good enough for the police out there. I believe it was in Saskatoon. So they wrote him up. They fined him for $2,800. We'll see how that stands up in court. But, with every one of our freedoms that are being eroded and stepped on and pushed aside in the panic to try and stop a pandemic that I don't think the government can do much about, free press is now another one of the ones that they've been stepping on. So it'll be a great chat with Lee on that and a number of other items. So back to, of course, what's been dominating the news and certainly dominated it yesterday. Jason Kenney has kicked out, and I'll say Jason Kenney. They made it a caucus vote, I understand, but if it's not a fully secret ballot, it's not really a good vote. It's your way of saying vote to kick these guys out, or you'll be next on the list. So Drew Barnes, who's been outspoken for a long time, it's not terribly surprising that eventually they kicked him out. He's been a thorn in Jason's butt. He's certainly been outspoken on behalf of his constituents against the encompassing nature of the lockdowns, how it's harmed his local constituency of Medicine Hat while they have low infections, things such as that. He was, of course, one of the signatories, along with the other 18, I believe it was, on a letter, again, that was condemning Jason Kenney's lockdowns and policies and strategies. The other thing, though, that was more surprising was it was Todd Loewen. Now, he was the caucus chair, so they keep calling him a backbencher. Yeah, he's not technically in cabinet, but this was a senior caucus member, multi-term. I've known Todd for quite some time, actually. Todd was so Todd put out a letter. He outright said he wants Jason Kenney to resign. So, I mean, again, it's not terribly shocking, I guess, that's going to lead to having his getting kicked out. I mean, it puts Kenney in a terrible position. What do? You leave an MLA in who's outright saying they want you kicked out of caucus, or do we, kick him out? So that's what happened. And while they were at it, I think they took advantage of that breaking situation in order to get rid of Barnes, killing two birds with one stone, I guess you could say. Now, Todd is he's not like Drew. He's not one of the ones who's there to make a lot of noise. They're different characters, I guess is a better way to put it. They're both of the old Wild Rose stock, which is worth noting. They're from the original Wild Rose Party. They both are multi-term MLAs based on that. UCP, this is their first, and clearly last term with them. But Todd isn't inclined to rock in the boat like that. And it's really quite telling to see that he resigned his own position in there. He spoke up and demanded the resignation of the premier. People should keep that in mind. This wasn't a person who's prone to impulsive actions, to coming out and trying to undercut from underneath. Him and I served actually on the Wild Rose executive together. I think I was VP policy back then. And Todd was the Northern Zone director, I believe. And he ran multiple times. I think it was noted in an article I read recently. Like, he's a committed man, to getting in there and making political change and getting his view out. So for Todd to finally hit his breaking point and say he wants Kenney to resign, that shows that he's been pushed to what he feels is a corner. He's had enough. I mean, you know how it works in an old PC-style government, which is clearly becoming what the UCP is. If you stay quiet, you toe the line, you kiss butts enough, you'll find your way into cabinet. If you got ambition, the way to do it is to follow the leader. Todd's not non-ambitious, obviously, or, he wouldn't even have run for MLA. That's a lot of work for a thankless job. But obviously, he didn't want that sort of political future. He'd rather speak for himself. Now, kicking them out, has this gotten rid of the problem? Not even close, Something that made a lot of news yesterday, the main thing was the Western Standard was covering it. We were on it. We were on top of it. We broke it. We followed it. We might as well have almost been in the caucus meeting. It was being leaked to the Western Standard. There were people leaking info as it happened, as the vote came to expel those MLAs, as the discussions came. It was constantly leaking to the Western Standard. And it was funny as all hell, to be honest. At one point, there was a story about how they were having a meeting on shutting up leaks, and that meeting was being leaked to us as they talked about it. But what that shows is cracks in party unity, and so people think, well, those two are gone. You won't hear about it anymore. I assure you that boat's leaking from more than just two spots. And Kenney is going to have to get it together. He's going to have to get, loyalty within that caucus. He's going to have to get them feeling like they're moving in a direction that's positive. I mean, that's why they got into it. Other things that we're telling out of Todd Loewen's letter, the biggest pressures, things that we're getting on Jason Kenney's case for all of us, whether it's outside of the party or inside, was his pandemic response, things such as that. Todd didn't mention any of that. I guess he did speak a lot to it, when he was speaking up for himself before they kicked him out of the caucus there. But no, most of what he was going on about was, again, the shortcomings of leadership, issues with the doctors, issues with the coal mining, issues with fighting with nurses, and a closed leaders circle, I guess you could say. And I've heard that from a number of sources. If you aren't on, and what is a very small inner circle of Jason Kenney's, you're outside. You're just a barking seal on the back bench. And that's frustrating. And that doesn't allow them to speak up for their constituents. It doesn't allow them to do their full job in a representative democracy. And this isn't unusual. It's not unique to Jason Kenney. But the thing is, as a leader, if you want to pull off that sort of tightness, you have to maintain that loyalty. You have to make those members feel like they're taking part, that they're inside. And if you sit there and surround yourself with a bunch of Ontario-based staffers, and that's what it is. He imported the staffer class from Ottawa. That's just what Alberta needs. More Ottawa. Yeah, right. You want to know a little bit of why Kenney, and there's one of the areas where Todd was strong on it. Andrew has been strong on him. Kenney has been terrifically weak in pushing back on Ottawa. I mean, it's been pathetic. He's been grudgingly dragged to try and speak up against Ottawa. He struck that Fair Deal panel, which has now turned out to be an utter joke. I mean, it toured around. It was obviously modeled just to calm us down, just to say, here, I'm doing something about it. Go to these town hall meetings, vent your spleen, but we're not actually going to do anything about it. And it will conclude some things that we've been talking about for 20 years, getting a provincial police force, getting a pension plan, things like that. And he hasn't done a damn thing. All he did is strike more commissions following that. Come on. How long do you expect us to sit still and take that crap, Jason? You got to follow through. But where is he getting the advice, do you think? To think that he can keep ignoring regionalism, ignoring the basis that the West is fed up, the West is ticked off. I'm not talking about embracing secessionism even, but just showing a strong stance against Ottawa, recognizing Ottawa is the problem. Ottawa is not our friend. We need to push back against them, and Kenney won't do it. Well, again, he's surrounded himself with all of these Ottawa staffers from his federal time. He's not listening to his MLAs who are on the ground, that are talking to the constituents, that are talking to the people who elected the UCP and won't elect him in the future if he doesn't change something dramatically. People are saying, oh, you're going to put the NDP back in. Nobody is putting the NDP back in except for a guy who's letting a majority party fall by the wayside. Don't blame people who have abandoned a party for a vote split. I despise that. So you're supposed to swallow a smaller mouthful of shit versus taking a chance on the bigger one? No, we vote with principle. And if it means, unfortunately, that the bloody socialists get in, and that would be terrible. It's not our fault. We're not going to sit back and take bad governance, not over and over and ongoing. So Lowen isn't alone. He's not alone by a long shot. And this isn't over by a long shot, not even close. I hope at the very least, and I'm saying this grudgingly, I'm not one of those people who was always on Kenny's case. I was supportive of him. I wanted to see the UCP do well. I wanted to see them really shake things up, bring Alberta back on course. I understand the pandemic was unexpected and it was going to challenge any party. It was going to challenge any leader. But I mean, these problems were happening before the pandemic hit, well before it. And now that we have that crisis on top of it, we're clearly seeing a crisis in leadership. I am regretfully saying it's time for Jason Kenney to go. I really wanted him to do well. I expected more. I really respected his work in Ottawa. I respected his time with the Taxpayers Federation in Alberta, getting on Ralph Klein's case. I mean, he got rid of those gold-plated pension plans. If it wasn't for Kenney lobbying back then, they'd still be getting those gross pension plans and returns. But he's turned into a terrible premier. I'm sorry. That's just the fact of it. You can't seem to get it together. You can't seem to maintain party loyalty. And the other part is you're not getting any voter loyalty. And then in the end, that's all that matters in a democracy. That's where you're going to see a lot more. What you're seeing right now are Wildrose based, and he hasn't unified that. That's part of it too. He technically brought the Wildrose and the PCs together into one room, but obviously they do not still feel like they're one unified unit. And it takes a while. If people remember farther back with the Alberta Alliance and the Wildrose Party, that was a split and we merged. And it took years before we would identify as just the Wildrose Party rather than I'm from the Alliance bunch and I'm from the Wildrose bunch. Well, it also takes leadership to bring that unity, that sense to make it one group, one party. And Kenney hasn't been able to do that. So it's the Wildrosers who are speaking up right now. When you see those 18 people who signed that letter questioning his pandemic response, that was people from the original Wildrose bunch. When you see Todd Lowen, you see Drew Barnes, it's the Wildrose bunch. But what's going to change with the PC bunch? So the progressive conservatives, the old stock ones that we worked so hard to get rid of, and it looks like a great deal of them slithered right back in there, the old Redford PCs. Well, they have no loyalty when they fear for their own seats. And if you look at the polling numbers in Calgary and in Edmonton, there are no urban MLAs are going to get their seats back in the next election unless something dramatically changes. So whether they want to speak up or push back based on personal principle, on policies, or whether they'll do it just on the fact that they want to save their own jobs, again, unless Kenney manages to turn some things around really fast, they're going to turn on him too. So yesterday was a very telling day. It's been boiling for a while. It came to a head. Not everybody was terribly shocked, but it's funny. It's listening and seeing some of the emails. Who are the leakers? Who are the leakers? Guys, it's coming from all over, and it's going to keep coming because again, people don't feel bonded with the party. They don't feel loyal to the party. You don't blame somebody for not feeling that connection. It's the job of the leader to make them feel that way, to make them feel like they're participating. And they aren't. They aren't. So, again, the ball's in Jason Kenney's court. I do feel for him. He's in a terrible, untenable position, but he's had 2 years to get it together. And we're not seeing any indication he is. Stop talking about the pandemic altogether, which is a huge issue. I'm not saying he should stop talking about it, but let's look at all those other policy issues. He's increasing spending outside of pandemic spending. He's increasing taxes in certain areas. He hasn't cut the size of government. He hasn't made the grassroots a viable thing. He put out direct democracy legislation that was a slap in our face. That was another one. That was another final straw. Oh, look, he's finally tossing us a bone. I was thrilled when he said, we're going to put that referendum policy on the table and we're going to put recall on the table. And then they set the bar so high to trigger those things that we know they'll never be used. And he knows that too. So again, he paid lip service to us. He said, this is what we'll do, or this is what we'll tell you we'll do so that we can get elected. But in reality, they turned their back on us. And we're sick of that. We're sick to death of it. Maybe it's going to take more election cycles. I don't know, but Kenny has a terribly huge problem right now on his hands, and a lot of it is a problem of his own making. And I wish it hadn't been. I guess there is a special talent. Very few, I wrote on that. It hasn't gone through the editing yet. Conservatives are a real pain in the butt. We are hard to lead. I mean, Rachel Notley has it easy. You ever hear any of her caucus members speak up? No, they're socialists. They are inherently followers. They want their leader to tell them what to do, and they will do it. If anything, they will lose control if the leader starts trying to let them speak for themselves. They don't expect that or want it. It's a form of responsibility. Socialists don't want responsibility. They want somebody else to take responsibility. Leaving it to conservatives, libertarian-minded people, we don't want to be told what to do. It's very opposite. So the more you try to make us walk in a row, the more there's going to be people flinging off to the left and right and all over the place. And it makes for very difficult political organization. And certainly in Alberta, we're as individualist as it gets, and we keep splitting and spawning new parties, but we aren't going to change our nature. So you have to learn to deal with it. Klein had the royal jelly. He managed to hold it together. Stephen Harper federally managed to hold it together. I mean, there's always factioning, there's always fighting and so on, but they managed to pull it together. Stockwell Day on the other end had a terrible time trying to hold it together, with the reform, and then you had the Canadian Reform Alliance Party off to the side, the crap party, and all these other things. Redford, it fell apart under her. Stelmach, it fell apart under her. I think somebody pointed out recently, we haven't had anybody win re-election as a premier since Ralph Klein, I believe. I could be wrong, but yes, it's been a long time. So we put them up and we tear them down. But to have, again, Kenny trying things. I see Daryl quote, posting a comment. Yeah, a quote from Jason Kenney. I hold the pen. Those were some of the statements. Again, you're not respecting the grassroots. Also, when Kenny threatened to call a snap election to get his caucus in line about a month ago. Think about that. I mean, this is a guy who's at the end of his rope. Obviously, Kenny's a smart, strategically thinking man. But to bark out something like that, that's brutal. And again, of course, it leaked to the Western Standard right away when he said it's a caucus. And now he's going to have to start talking to caucus. And yeah, it's going to keep leaking to us. So you better start talking the right language, Kenny, because it's not behind closed doors anymore. And it won't be. But that's enough of my ranting on the latest of breaking issues in Alberta. There'll be a lot more talking about it. There's going to be a lot more breaking on this. Like I said, this is just the trickle that's probably going to turn into a waterfall. I think part of the reason there's a turning point right now, too, is we're 2 years out from another election. Part of what Kenny put off the leadership review for himself, too, was 6 months before the next election, because he knows nobody wants to rip into a leadership review 6 months before an election because it'll be more damaging than good. But when you got 2 years to work on it, well, you know what? Theoretically, you could take out a leader and replace the leader and hopefully get things back on track, which they desperately need to get back on track. So I see that guest in the waiting area there. I should bring her in. It's Kris Sims from the Taxpayers Federation. And I'll pull up this image from what they put out with the BC emissions are going up, even though they have the highest carbon taxes in Canada. Good work, BC. I'm glad somebody could work as the guinea pig to show how effective carbon taxes are, though, it's at a very terrible price. People still are paying that bill. But I'm glad for the Taxpayers Federation to be out there and talking about this and exposing it, because otherwise I'm not hearing a lot about from the mainstream media from that. So how are you doing today, Kris?
Excellent. Thank you so much for having us on.
Oh, it's always, like I said, great to get the Taxpayers Federation people on. We're of like mind, and I just like having people coming out who are fighting for less government rather than people always asking for more of my money. And I don't have much left anymore. So, but that was, carbon taxes are a huge issue. They're huge federally. They're huge provincially. We seem to feel that if we can tax ourselves enough, somehow we'll make the planet greener, or somehow it'll get Ottawa off our case, or somehow it'll buy a social license. It seems to be failing kind of on all of those fronts. So maybe if you could run down what you've discovered with BC.
It really is failing on all fronts, and we're really glad to have this opportunity to warn people about this, because BC is the shining example of carbon taxes. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau first announced his first federal carbon tax, he cited British Columbia, my home province out here in the West, many times. And now that we have the Conservative Party leader Erin O'Toole singing the praises of carbon taxes, his second carbon tax is actually based on BC's, which is also the highest in all of Canada. And I need to be very clear. When we were first had the carbon tax imposed on us here in BC back in the year 2008, politicians told us lots of things. They told us that it would be revenue neutral, that it would stop at $30 a ton, that it would fund, a plethora of affordable alternative energies. And this is key. They told us that it would make emissions go down. Today, none of that is true. None of it. It is $45 a ton. It's not even called revenue neutral anymore. Nearly $2 billion goes into general revenue from BC taxpayers every year. That's just in the first carbon tax. And emissions are going up, not down. Very interestingly, it was the feds this time around who compiled the data for all of the provinces, by the way, including British Columbia, and the Justin Trudeau government quietly posted it on the United Nations website last month. Funny, there was no press conference about this because emissions have gone up. They've gone up 11% in the past 4 years. So between the year 2015 and the year 2019, that's the latest data that we have, they went up 11%. And when you break it down further, road transportation has gone up by 13%. On average, it's around 15% or so for SUVs and light trucks. Those heavy-duty big rigs that deliver everything we eat and use, that's up around 20%. So really across the board on all the essentials where we need to actually get to work and feed ourselves, those emissions have gone up. So our point is, carbon taxes are an expensive, useless failure. The only thing they do is cost average people more money to live their lives, and it doesn't help the environment.
Yeah, well, I almost wonder, though, if the federal government, though they obviously did it quietly, it was more of your, Friday afternoon before a long weekend release rather than a Monday morning, let's celebrate something release. But they did release it. But doesn't that perhaps set the stage for the real carbon tax aficionados to say, well, you see, the provincial governments just aren't doing it right. So we've got to bring in our federal one and do it at $200 a ton and reduce any exemptions. And then we can really fix things. If we could just carbon tax harder, we'll reduce those emissions. I mean, I'm speculating here, but perhaps that's some of the motivation on where they're going with this.
Well, really, there's not much more to give. Most people have a lot of trouble paying these taxes. In fact, over 40% of Canadians are within $200 of not being able to cover all their monthly bills. So the translation for that is insolvency. So they can't carbon tax you harder on something that you need to do. So folks need to get to work. They need to go to school. They need to heat their homes because they don't feel like freezing to death. And this is really important. We need to eat. A lot of folks don't realize how much carbon taxes affect agriculture. Farmers, of course, use a lot of diesel, including diesel for the trucks to haul things to market and natural gas to dry grains. And really, everything in our food chain in Canada does consume grains at one point or another. And so that increases the cost of the groceries that you're buying at the store. If you've noticed an increased cost in groceries, carbon taxes play a factor there, but they don't get the press. It's not a sexy topic. And so that's why we're trying to sound the alarm bell. Hey, we're the example out here in BC. We've had the highest carbon tax in Canada since it first started, and all we're doing is getting ripped off. It's not lowering emissions.
Well, yeah, and it should be huge, and people should be speaking of that. I mean, on the bottom line, if you're assuming that emissions are the biggest problem facing us today, the rising oceans, all of those issues, polar bears losing their fur or whatever it is week by week, then we have to address it. Well, you have to address it with something that works then. And if it's exposed that this doesn't work, the fluffy bunnies aren't any fluffier, the trees aren't any greener, then we have to re-examine our entire approach to it. But
yes, exactly. And the answer isn't we'll just do it harder because when you do the math, man, once that carbon tax, the first one is up to $170 a ton, I don't know how folks are going to be able to afford it, honestly. And then if it goes even higher than that, I don't know what they're going to do. I need to stress, too, that we actually have two carbon taxes here in BC. There's the main one that everybody talks about at $45 per ton. That works out to about 10 cents per liter of gasoline and about 12 cents per liter of diesel. So figure out your fuel tank capacity, do the math. And there's a secret one, a second carbon tax. It's a regulation that's tucked into fuel standards. It's actually higher than the first one. It actually costs you about 14 cents more per liter for gasoline and about 15.5 cents per liter for diesel. So combined, let's do the math. Combined, the two carbon taxes here in BC are about 24 cents per liter of gas. That's why if you ever come over the Rockies when you're allowed to, and you visit BC, you have that sticker shock at the gas pump. That's why we have on average 24 cents per liter of gasoline. When you do that math, that's around $18 extra per minivan. If you drive one of those light duty Dodge Ram pickup trucks, I'm not even talking the heavy duty ones. I'm just talking your average, longer box 1500 series light duty Dodge Ram. That's around $30 extra just in the carbon taxes it costs you to fill up here. And then you figure trickle down. Imagine what that is for diesel, for farmers, for all of that stuff. That's why it's so bloody expensive out here. And we're not getting anything for it. We have higher emissions than we did before.
Well, and the theory is that it would change our behavior and we would make choices that have less emissions. But we're in a northern country. We don't have a choice. I mean, you add 50% to my gas bill, it means I'm going to pay that much extra. I mean, I might insulate a little better, or chances are I'll sneak a wood stove into the house and burn some firewood, but that's not going to help much on emissions. I can't escape that. Windmills are not going to heat my house, and solar panels are too expensive. We aren't there yet. It seems that they're trying to push us away from the most cost-effective option, but we haven't developed an option to move towards yet.
Yes, exactly. Smart people, the economist type, would describe this as an inelastic demand. So the ability to feed yourself, to heat your home, and for transportation, that is an inelastic demand, meaning it doesn't stretch back and forth. That isn't something you can go, oh, well, I'll opt for paper bags or plastic bags or cloth diapers or disposable diapers, depending on what you want to do. And to be clear, I'm a born and raised BC girl. I love the environment. I used cloth diapers. I sewed myself. When I lived in Ottawa, I rode a bicycle. I get it. I could almost hug a tree. I get it. But it's not working. The emissions are going up, not down. And we need to be clear, this isn't just an option for people. They can't just choose to not heat their home, and they can't just choose to magically afford to possibly heat their home with a solar panel, which they still can't technologically do right now. These aren't options for folks. So all they're doing is eating it. They're eating this cost, or they're taking out lines of credit, they're going deeper into debt, or they're doing without while emissions go up. And so it's just fundamentally unfair to keep doing this. And it's one of the reasons why the huge broken promise by Erin O'Toole with the Conservative parties is such a big deal. They signed our pledge to scrap Justin Trudeau's carbon tax and not impose one of their own. Now they're turning around and they're imposing two, because this is key. Trudeau's second carbon tax is actually right now set to be a little bit lower than it is here in BC. But the Conservatives' carbon tax, right in their document, based on BC's. So get ready for those Vancouver gas prices that you're shocked at all the time. Get ready to see those in your hometown.
Yeah, well, and it doesn't seem that O'Toole's carbon tax has won the hearts and minds of voters either. So the likelihood of him getting the opportunity to impose his version of the carbon tax isn't looking terribly good, though things could change. I guess you still have to presume and look at how those policies would apply if they ever become applying. So, I mean, I'll just go to a side story about greenwashing, because it seems like that's kind of what the carbon tax is it's looking like you're doing something. You do something, and the favorite tool of many governments is a tax. And they've taken on carbon taxes in order to do so. But you just mentioned about loving the bush or loving nature. And I worked for 20 years as an oil field surveyor and exploration projects. And I love it out there. And they call us in the oil field, they think I'm out there just to tear stuff down and ruin it. And it's far from it. And I spent 4 years working in the Arctic in winter. Not my favorite stints. I much preferred the Gulf of Mexico, but you didn't get a choice. And what we would do is freeze a barge into the ice in summertime, build your camp on it. And then once things are frozen enough out in the ocean there in the Delta, we would actually build an ice road out to it from Inuvik and stay there for the winter and do our job. The problem was the barge, of course, there's 80 people living on this barge out there frozen in the dark ocean. Effluent, we're using the bathrooms, we're doing things. So it goes into these holding tanks. And we would get this truck to come twice a day and pump the tanks out and drive it all the way to a certified disposal facility for sewage in Tuktoyaktuk. And when I was on some time off, I went for a drive to Tuk, and I went and looked, and I found the spot where they dispose of it. It's a big vent with a big giant pipe, and they put the hose into it, and they pump the effluent into it, and it goes right under the ice into the ocean, where it probably flows under our barge about 2 weeks later. It goes right raw into the sea. So we burn how many hundreds and hundreds of gallons of fuel a day to have this truck going back and forth, transporting these turds across the ice, just to pump them right back into the water. But the bottom line is, on paper, it feels good. It looks good. We didn't put anything into the ocean that wasn't, we used a certified sewage disposal facility and left it at that. But either way, it's a long running story, but it's the truth of how some of these things work. The impression of looking like you're doing something is often much more important than actually doing something. So when it's been exposed that the carbon tax isn't doing anything, why is the government carrying on with it? And all I can think is tax grab then.
Yes, exactly. So it's a huge tax grab here in BC. And I'll give you an example. So back when it was first launched in 2008, we had a BC Liberal government here, which, as your viewers will know, is kind of a purple tent. It's like a mix of federal Liberals and provincial Conservatives and all that stuff. So it used to be the old Social Credit Party, and then they basically changed their name. So it was introduced then by Premier Gordon Campbell in the year 2008. And to be fair, when it was first put in, they had a corresponding income tax cut that was equal, they estimated, to what the carbon tax cost would be for people. Okay, on paper, that seems revenue neutral. But here's the catch. Whenever you have politicians involved, it didn't take them very long to start playing with the books. And your viewers, and you will get this, so I'll explain it. Other folks don't get it. After a few years, they started playing with the books by doing this. They'd have all of the carbon tax revenue in the budget document, all listed on how much it was. Say, for argument's sake, it was $1 billion. Then, underneath that bracket, they started stuffing a whole bunch of random tax credits into it. Some of it pre-existing, much of it having zilch to do with the environment. I mean, BC film tax credit, seniors tax credit, fitness tax credit, little kids taking art tax credit. And they managed to balance it all out to zero by putting $1 billion of the tax credits into that. Abracadabra, revenue neutral. So it was just an accounting game that they were playing for years on end. That was the BC Liberals. Then the NDP came into power, and they have a majority now. They dropped the term revenue neutral altogether. They just threw it out the window. They're like, yeah, we're not calling it that anymore. This isn't the reality. That was very interesting because a certain guy named John Horgan, back when he used to be on the opposition benches of the NDP, he used to rail against the carbon tax, and for good reason. And this was back when it was, oh goodness, I think it was like 5 cents a liter or something like that. He used to say, folks won't be able to afford to heat their homes. They won't be able to afford to drive to work. This is an unfair tax, especially on lower income people. It's not going to work. Turns around, now he's premier, and we've got the highest carbon tax in Canada. So my theory is actually that a lot of folks, you're right, want to feel they're doing something. They want to be kind of seen on the surface as if they're doing something. So in a way, the carbon tax says, again, 24 cents per liter while you're filling up your car, is almost like a sin tax. Or it's almost like they're trying to greenwash their conscience to say, oh, well, I'm paying this tax, therefore it's going to help emissions. It's not. People need to accept this fact that emissions go up while our carbon taxes go up. If they truly wanted to do something to help the environment, for real, let's sell our natural gas to India. India has hundreds of millions of people who are burning wood and animal dung for their daily needs to heat their homes and cook their food. That has a terrible level of emissions and indoor pollutants, and it's usually women and children who are tasked with gathering this fuel all day. They're asking Canada for natural gas. Let's sell it to them, and their emissions will drop dramatically. Therefore, global emissions will drop dramatically, and we have good jobs here while we're exporting a much cleaner fuel. That's a good solution.
That's great. You got well ahead of me there because I was getting on to the solution part. And yeah, it's interesting, though, diving in a bit on that self-flagellation factor. People feel a little better if, well, I paid at the pump, so I've done my thing, so now I'm justified in leaving a little dog poop in the park or something because I paid my carbon tax and I'm okay with it. But it's funny with the deception, I guess, or the way people look at things. And that's why we got to discuss and expand more on them. I remember having a large battle back when we had healthcare premiums in Alberta with a fellow. And he was saying, well, healthcare, in the States costs such and such, or, the usual discussions. But here for me, it only cost me like $600 a year. Dude, you're under this impression that those premiums are everything that it costs. That's just a fraction of what it costs. But in his head, look, I paid it, so I can utilize it. I can go to the doctor every time I get a hangnail because I paid my $60 a month or whatnot. There's I guess, the psyche of people, the reality. They feel they've paid a fee, and it allows them to get away with things. But getting back to that, so you're in the middle of the battleground when it comes to liquid natural gas. We're seeing the projects. I mean, it seems to be people talk about it being the future. They talk about, particulate emissions in India, China, whether we like them or not these days, they're burning a lot of terrible stuff. A lot of developing countries, though, are huge markets that are building up, Brazil even perhaps, and they could really utilize this. They could wean themselves from coal. They can wean themselves from wood, a lot of things. But our environmentalists are saying, no, we've got to lock it in the ground. We've got to shut our pipelines down. And they're getting our companies to divest from liquid natural gas projects. How is the outlook on your LNG future in BC right now?
That's a great point. And it drives me crazy when I hear some of these environmentalists. And I personally would describe myself as an environmentalist based on what I just said earlier. Like whenever I go walking with my kids to creeks or rivers, I always bring an extra bag. I'm always picking up litter. You have to embrace your environment and take care of it. It's part of stewardship. I personally believe that. It's part of stewardship. Clean up after yourself and don't make a bloody mess. But what's really frustrating about some of these NGO kind of big E environmentalists is that they don't get it. They don't seem to understand that if you look around your room right now and try to find something that is not either a direct derivative of oil, so nylon, plastic, anything like that, or that hasn't been manufactured using it or trucked to you using it, or even sent you on a barge if you ordered it from China that uses bunker fuel. You'd be hard pressed to find anything around you that isn't from oil and gas. And there's this huge disconnect there. And they also don't seem to look at the actual data and try to understand how we can have the most minimal effect on the environment while maintaining our standard of living and using energies properly. It just seems to be this knee-jerk, leave it in the ground, and then what? To hell with everybody else? What are they supposed to do? Is India just going to keep burning the wood and the animal dung? Is China just going to keep burning coal, year after year and building plants, day after day, it seems? We have to have practical solutions to this. And then when you try to offer alternatives, things like natural gas or even modular nuclear, which is the future, if you talk to some of these folks, sounds pretty exciting. I'm not sure if they're there yet. Sounds pretty exciting. And they just don't listen. And so that's where we start wondering, is this really your game plan? Do you really want to reduce emissions and help the environment? Because it sure doesn't sound like it. And I'll give you an example. Vancouver City Council, so beautiful area nestled right there in downtown. Vancouver is gorgeous. They are, divesting themselves from oil and gas, and they're even trying as best they can to bar people in their own homes from using natural gas furnaces. Like the natural gas is the boogeyman. And it's really strange because Premier John Horgan, back when he was an assistant staffer, he worked in the energy sector. He worked on the energy file. And I personally think that's why he's not so hostile towards natural gas. He hasn't been a fan of Trans Mountain or any Kinder Morgan or things like that. But when it comes to the natural gas pipeline that's slowly working its way across northern BC, he's been pretty permissive of it for a New Democrat in the modern sense. So that's very interesting. And that one's still going ahead. Tons of folks are working on it. People who live locally. I'm sure there's some folks from Alberta who are working on the pipeline, First Nations women, you name it, providing tons of great jobs. But this is the catch. There seems to be, again, it's a sin tax almost on a global level. Because they're allowing that pipeline to go through to sell natural gas to other people, it's as if they're taking on the burden and the guilt and the sin tax themselves by forcing British Columbians to not be able to use our own natural gas and our own natural resources. The big push now is electrifying absolutely everything and getting hooked on just BC Hydro as your sole source of energy. Not quite sure how that's going to work out. But as of right now, it is still a major battlefield here, even with something as clean burning as natural gas in BC.
Yeah, well, and it's painful. I mean, you talk about the inelasticity, and that's the reality. I mean, energy, of all things, if you're going to make it expensive, it impacts every aspect of our living. I mean, we can't avoid it. Part of the great lifestyle we enjoy on a world scale is because we have abundant, cost-effective energy sources. And I think if anybody talks about being, having a heart and caring about the third world and caring about developing nations, we should be sharing this. We should be getting it up there to get them up to our level. And it shows that elitism and vanity where Trudeau loves virtue signaling, but he still, would bite his own tongue before saying maybe we could, again, get some of our products over there to help them come along and live a cleaner, more prosperous lifestyle like ourselves. But again, we reached that front. So we've got inflation starting to hit us. I mean, this is something the Taxpayers Federation, talks about, and economists. We've been borrowing like mad. We've been living on the credit cards on every level of government. It's going to catch up with us. It's unavoidable. We can't keep printing money like this. Cost of living is going to shoot up, and energy is going to be part of it. So where, though, because when everybody's screaming for the government to do more, I mean, I almost don't fault the government fully. They are responding to people on the ground who keep saying, take care of me. Where can we start cutting without a government getting thrown out of office for daring to try?
I think we need to change our own hearts and minds. See, not you and I specifically, but we need to make it normal to stop asking the government for everything. We need to make it part of the culture of smaller, more accountable government and do for yourself. So lower taxes, less waste, and more accountability. It's literally why the CTF, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, was founded. We were founded back in 1990. And that was when the deficits really started taking center stage. And we had all of those fights, the no more taxes fights, all those rallies, all those forums. And so this is why we're here. And I think it's important to spread the message to average people. So the next time we're allowed to gather and all that other stuff, you tell both your, as I lovingly try to say, your crazy right-wing uncle and your flaky, loving left-wing sister that we need to stop looking to government for absolutely everything. Ask yourself, I'll put it this way. I have to save money all the time, as everybody does. Anybody who helps run a family, you're always trying to shop and save for money. So when you're in a store and you have something in your hand, you should ask yourself, do I really need this? Next question, is this the best possible price I can get for this? And next question is, can I wait? Can I do without it for a little while longer? That's what budget conscious people do every single day. So we need to do that when it comes to government. Do I really need this? Can we really afford this? Can we do this in a more economical way that will save money? And we need to make it normal. So the next time you have a friend or a family member or a coworker, if you can say it nicely, who is saying the government this, the government that, we need this, we need that, free this, put a penny in the shoe and say, you know what? Every time you get them to pay for something for you, that's going on not only your credit card, that's going on your grandkids' credit card now, because we're that far gone. We're more than $1 trillion in debt. So it's not you or I, unless, you're a Highlander. I like to be pretend of a vampire. I'm immortal. I'm not going to be there. I'm not going to be there when we're paying this thing off, but my kids will be, and my grandkids will be. Is it fair to nuke them with these bills plus interest? No, most decent people would say it's not. And so that's what I would do. I would encourage everybody that to come to this line of thinking, and then we can tell our MLAs and our MPs to stop spending all this money and to stop strangling our natural resources. Because right now at this stage, the way we're treating our natural resources and the way we're spending, we're eating our seed corn, which means we won't have anything to plant next year.
Yeah, no, we're really just pissing it away at a regular, record level, and it's terrifying. It does come back to that fear of personal responsibility, I think, and we have to change the mindset. Boy, changing a mindset is a very difficult thing to try and do. Hard times can be the times when those mindsets change, though, and they're approaching. I hope we could get some of this under control. And yeah, there's that instinct, like if your local little league team runs out of money and they can't function next year, unfortunately, what you hear is everybody screaming, well, the city should fund it so that they can keep going. Well, hang on. Why? This is your local thing. Talk to your neighbors or get the kids selling magazine subscriptions door to door. Okay, I'm showing my age.
Door knocking. Yep, absolutely.
The old ways, get the pizza place down the road to sponsor them. But a person's first instinct is the government's got to pay for this. And the government, of course, well, you got to respond to elected official. Well, I want to shut up, Karen down the road. I got to beat on a Karen, because she's really screaming for that team. So you know what? I'm going to make sure that we fund that. And then once you do, it's really hard to extricate yourself from that. But boy, we've got a lot of work to do. I mean, it comes back to the environmental thing, like you said as well. Like I've got a beautiful house. It's small, but it backs into the bush just outside of Calgary. And I walk the dogs back in the trees there all the time. I love it. And I tell you, it's spotless back there. People hike through that area. It's a game preserve and everything. But anytime I see a piece of garbage or anything, I pick it up. I'm not having that back behind my place. Now, once in a while, when I go hiking in the provincial park east of Bragg Creek, I mean, the government just imposed user fees, actually, to get into Kananaskis and everything in Alberta. People are throwing their crap all over the place. There's trash and things everywhere. But that's because, well, I'm on government land. We're paying somebody else to pick it up. That's the attitude of some. Not, most people, I think, are such pigs. But unfortunately, far too many are, and it comes back to, it's not my responsibility to clean it up. It's the government's. And it comes back to, as well, as if I paid to have the government do it. There's where I'm kind of fearful. I'm all about user fees. I like the idea, actually, of charging access to these parks. But some pigs, I think, are going to feel that's more license to chuck their stuff as well. I paid for that. Somebody will come take care of it.
I paid the admission, so the usher is going to come and sweep up the popcorn that I dumped all over everywhere. I know it's a bit of a tough situation there. I'll give you an example. And so this, to me, the best way to help people come to your line of thinking on this sort of stuff isn't just to use numbers, it's to use personal examples. And so if you know anybody in Ontario, for example, who lived during the former Liberal government there, especially under Kathleen Wynne, the former premier there, ask them about their hydro bills. Chances are their hydro bills went through the roof to the point where they probably struggled paying it. I'll give you an example. We were renting a small bungalow in Ottawa. I was doing like laundry at midnight. I only used LEDs. We used natural gas for heat, but our bill was still more than $400 a month. That's how crazy those bills got. And we were some of the ones on the lower end of the spectrum. There were some folks living in more rural areas of Ontario that were seeing hydro bills for like $1,200 a month. And it actually started causing what's called energy poverty. And we don't need to go to, fire-breathing right-wingers to get this sort of thing. Go to the Ontario Food Bank website and look up energy poverty, and they did a record amount of business, unfortunately, during those years because working people couldn't afford their energy bills. And this is to light their homes and to make sure things run. These weren't luxury items. And so if you want to have energy poverty at the level that they had during Premier Kathleen Wynne's time in Ontario, one of the main reasons Doug Ford became premier, he said he'd fix the hydro mess. They kind of sort of have a little bit if you squint and look at it sideways. That's one of the reasons why he's premier. So you ask folks who lived during those times of those crazy record high hydro prices, do you want to see this across Canada? No? Well, you better get on the horn and you better start telling your local MP to not do this nonsense, because the very same architects, like physically the same human beings who were in charge of that stupid green plan that caused all those problems in Ontario are now in the PMO. They're now in Ottawa, and they're branching this idea out across Canada. And unfortunately, here in BC, we're in the same boat. Knock wood, right now, BC hydro rates are mostly affordable for average people, but who knows if that's going to change tomorrow because of these ridiculous policies.
Yeah, well, and again, it gets down to the people on the ground. They seem to forget the concept of supply and demand at times as well. Some of the people promote and say, well, look, if you charged your car at your home rather than buying gas, it would cost you this much and it would save you this much. They try to approach it on that front. Well, okay, if we got into that dream world that a lot of people are promoting, that somehow, within 9 years, the majority of us are all going to be in electric vehicles and we're all electrified. We've all upgraded our houses. We've somehow upgraded all of the electrical grids, and we've somehow found the generating capacity. The price of energy is going to go through the roof because you have suddenly got a massive new demand on that power grid, and there's only one way to respond it. You raise the price. And the city-dwelling urban hipster who never even gets on a bus doesn't realize you still need the electricity to charge your iPhone so you can virtue signal with your selfies in Stanley Park. So your costs are going to go up even if you don't travel, and they've got to start to understand this. Once people get hit in the wallet, it's amazing how responsive they get.
Yes, exactly. And so that's why use an example like Ontario. A lot of folks might have family in Ontario. I know I do. Ask them what it was like, and then get them to do a little thought exercise and say, could you afford that? The answer is usually no. And again, when it comes down to supply and demand, this energy always comes from somewhere. It's the same thing as money. The money always comes from somewhere. And if they just print it in the basement, they're going to wind up with inflation, which is what we're staring down the barrel of right now federally. We just can't keep pretending and doing stuff like this. When it comes down to taxes and it comes down to things like oil and gas, I know you've looked at these numbers before. The fact that we don't have our proper and right pipeline capacity in Canada has cost us around $13 billion over 10 years, just in the federal taxes. We're not talking royalties. We're not talking municipal taxes, property taxes, nothing. $13 billion. You could build, I think, 6 new hospitals here in BC for just that amount that we've missed out on from federal taxes. So even if folks like to pretend that, I don't know, their handmade bicycle doesn't use any sort of oil and gas, they depend on things like oil and gas, even for things like their healthcare and their education, because that's one of the major fuels for our economic engine here in Canada.
Yeah, well, there's that cognitive dissonance that you know, the same people quite often who are screaming for the underprivileged, who want more social programs, more spending, more government involvement, are the same people who are trying to shut down every means of generating the funds to pay for these things. I mean, you got to think about it, guys. It's got to come from somewhere. If you want those hospitals, you want those homeless shelters, you want that subsidized housing, you want the daycare programs, fine, but somewhere, somebody has to pay the bill. And you can't shut down every industry and expect these things to get paid. But that's where they're sitting, though. And you know, I try to get reasonable with it. I'm going to pivot a bit, though, since we still got a bit of time here. Something we've had happening in Alberta. We had a flat tax for a little while, which was magnificent. Unfortunately, again, you know, the temptation to gouge further comes along, and I believe it was Redford who got rid of it, or perhaps it was even Stelmach. I can't remember now, but it went back to a progressive tax. And now Kenny is utilizing the tool that he used to decry as the federal, you know, in the federal government, which is called bracket creep. We didn't hear much about it anymore, but it's the invisible tax hike. We're getting nailed every year, and particularly when inflation starts kicking in, they are raising taxes on us while telling us they aren't, and that's a real annoying thing. But maybe if you could explain, is bracket creep happening in BC, and if not, just, you know, I'm sure it's happening in other provinces, how that works.
It's not happening to the same extent that it's happening in Alberta, and primarily it's because of the just differences in inflation, costs of living. I'll be blunt. The cost of living out in BC is outrageous. It's extremely expensive, not just for our oil and gas, but housing. People call it a housing crisis. It is. That doesn't mean that there needs to be a gigantic big government solution for the housing crisis. Perhaps they just need to get out of the way and stop, for example, charging PST on building supplies, which adds around $18,000 to the cost per house. So they could do something like that. But yeah, in Alberta, what's really disappointing is that you rightly point out that Jason Kenney used to rail against bracket creep and named it because, of course, he used to, way back in the day, be with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And we take on things like bracket creep, which is an automatic tax hike. And if you don't keep those brackets permanently where they are, as inflation goes up, as costs go up, your taxes go up. It just becomes automatic. And it's because it floats on top during bracket creep that you pay more. They need to cement those levels there and leave them there. This is the problem. So that isn't so much the problem here in BC. The problem here in BC is outrageous housing costs, outrageous carbon taxes, both hidden and non. And we have a PST on pretty much bloody everything. We even have a PST on used cars, used clothing. Has PST here. It's just disgusting. So, for example, say you go to Alberta and you buy a truck, like a used truck for, say you really got a good deal and you spent like $4,000 on it. You bring it back over here, you're going to be paying PST on that, and it's 13% because it's combined. It's outrageous what they charge you out here. It's so big a deal, the PST here in BC compared to our brothers over there in Alberta, is that back, I think it was 2005, the BC government got wind that people, smart people, when they were taking their summer tours out to Alberta, were waiting to buy their appliances in Alberta because they don't have to pay PST. Ding, ding, ding. It just makes sense. So while they went to Costco, they did their major shop, they would buy their appliances there and then bring them back across the Rockies. Again, smart shopping. You're saving money. The government got wind of this, and they were so hungry for our PST money that they actually contacted Costco in Alberta and said, hey, could you send us photos of the license plates of the BC drivers that are in your parking lots? I'm not kidding. So we can trace it back to their home and then nail them with these PST charges. Luckily, Costco told them to get bent and they weren't able to do it. But that's how hungry they are for taxes here. So that's more of our struggle there compared to what you guys are dealing with right now with the bracket creep issue. And I keep hearing from very smart, pointy-headed folks, usually in Edmonton, that you guys need a PST. Does that sound like that's happening soon? Yeah.
Oh, they keep trying to set the stage for it, and they leak it now and then, and they say, well, it's not off the table later. They're setting the stage. There's no doubt about it. They have more appetite to deal with coming challenges through raising taxes rather than reining in spending, which is very concerning. And it gets back to my earlier rant. As you've seen, there's been a lot of turmoil happening in Alberta between the small C Conservatives, I guess you could say, and the red Tories, the usual old battles. And I would say the red Tories have been winning in the Kenney government, and that's where spending has been going up. And yeah, they're hinting at things like bringing in a sales tax rather than talking like Jason Kenney of 25 years ago and saying we need to get spending under control.
Yeah, your government employees on average make quite a bit more than even government employees out here in BC. And you guys tease us for being all lefty in that. But when you do the comparison, for example, no matter really where you look for when it comes to government employees in Alberta, typically you guys are paying them a lot more than we are out here in BC. That's even with the cost of living and housing differences. So you guys don't have the PST out there, your carbon tax is lower, and typically your housing is much lower cost. Whereas out here, it's much higher on all fronts, but the wages are lower. So yeah, you might want to sharpen the pencil out there for the BC.
For quite some time with the budget that Jason pretended he was going to balance, and he obviously never will. He did talk the talk again prior to becoming premier and pointing out at BC, if we could just cut our spending per capita to BC levels, because people forget that's the left coast, but you know what? They are showing more spending restraint than us. They spend far less per capita than we do. If we could bring it down to there, because is the world over in BC? Are they dying in the streets for lack of government spending? No. Well, then why can't we do so? But that talk has been lost now that he's in the premier's chair and the spending just keeps climbing and climbing. And I'm glad you pointed it out because it's a myth. I'm sorry, guys. We have not behaved responsibly in Alberta. We call ourselves conservatives, but we spend our way out of our problems. And with the energy revenue going down, and as a whole separate discussion as to why it's so far down, through infrastructure and things like that, we've exposed just how bad our government is. And that's why Naheed Nenshi is running for the hills in Calgary, because downtown Calgary is getting closer to a 40% vacancy rate. That's how it's a ghost town down there. It is 40%? Unbelievable. And
wow.
And they thrived on those. I mean, the last number I think was 32%, but realistically, there's a lot of companies still stuck in leases. As soon as the lease is up, they're out of there. And so those office buildings are standing nearly empty. And they used to just milk them because there were all those oil company head offices, and those oil companies just, rather than fight with government, just take the tax increases. So then the city just spent like crazy. Well, now those companies are gone. And that's where we had 400% business tax increases happening a couple of years ago. That's why people were protesting in front of City Hall. Business owners were protesting. And provincially, we're seeing the same thing. The government got spoiled. They got lazy. They felt that this revenue will be there forever. And they bloated the spending. And now they've hit the wall. But the thing is, there doesn't seem to be the will to recover from that. They just seem to be looking for new sources of money. And that's not going to help.
No, because you can't get blood out of a stone. And folks, the average working Albertan has been pretty hurting for the last little while. I've got some family experience in the natural resources sector. And when the NEP hit back in the early 80s, it was brutal. People aren't doing so well in the private sector, but I keep reading headlines that in the government sector, they're not taking cuts. They didn't have, 15 or 20% salary reductions. They didn't allow for massive attrition or early retirement in order to trim their books. They're not doing that, and they have to. It's just fundamentally unfair if they don't, because otherwise this whole "we're all in this together" is just an empty platitude.
Well, yeah. And I mean, aside from whether policies are effective or not with restrictions, lockdowns, stuff like that, but a lot of the policy discussion has come from people who have guaranteed salaries. And that's really slanted when you're examining restrictions, when you're sitting on a committee or where you're a medical professional or one of these others, and you're saying, we really need to shut all this stuff down. You're not coming from a perspective understanding that, yeah, your bills are all going to be paid. It's not going to impact you a bit, except in the social sense, perhaps. But you really are forgetting the person who can't pay their mortgage, the person whose business is going to go bankrupt, the person who doesn't know how on earth they're going to pay their rent or make their car payment. That's what's happening. But the decisions are being made by such a huge and supported by such a huge civil service. I mean, we've got a lot of unions standing up screaming, keep the lockdowns. Well, that's because all your members are having vacations right now. They're sitting at home and they're getting full pay. I can see why they support it, but this is not sustainable.
And that's fundamentally unfair because that is not true representative government. That is not the Commons. The Commons and representative government are supposed to represent common people, meaning they're affected by their decisions pretty much in the same way that other people aren't, who aren't in positions of power. And it's their responsibility to make sure that they are aware of it. It's one of the reasons why former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher always insisted upon everybody, including her cabinet ministers, to know how much milk cost, because that was a practical price point for people to be able to understand. And she was raised above the shop, so she knew what that was like. It's one of the reasons why, again, Ronald Reagan said very similar things. He wasn't raised in the lap of luxury. He was affected by the decisions that he made. And it's a fundamental responsibility of government to make sure that folks feel it the same way, no matter if they have a private sector job or a government job.
Yeah, well, and our government workers, again, and hey, a lot of them do a lot of hard work and do some important jobs, but they're guaranteed. They don't understand what income instability feels like. They have not suddenly had their income cut by 30%, 50% in a year. And, it's hard to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. It's always a challenge as humans, but we really need to try a little more of that, not just on the leadership level, but even on the people on the ground who are calling for the government to do more of these lockdowns. Please try to think of your neighbor who perhaps doesn't have that secured income that you do before you necessarily push for these things. And I mean, there's the health factor to take into account too. That's fine. But if we're looking, it's a cost benefit thing. People aren't looking at the cost nearly closely enough. So maybe I'll let you get going fairly soon here, though. So, in closing, where
I have
can
a
we
feeling
find?
we could talk all day.
We could. We'll tire folks out. Actually, I'm supposed to have Lee Harding coming on fairly soon, but he's not here quite yet. But as I said, I was going to take you to the top of the hour. But by all means, you've got the microphone. What would you like to put out there as what we should be doing, where we should be going?
I really want to stress to folks that, again, every time you talk to your friends and family in British Columbia, every time you see a terrifyingly high gas price in a place like Vancouver, understand this is coming to your local gas station. Understand that this will affect you unless we plead and beg politicians to change their minds and to see the light and realize that things like carbon taxes, both of them, are not working. And this is the government's data. It's its own data. This report that the Prime Minister posted on the UN website is more than 500 pages long. They've got charts for every single province. You can do crazy deep dives into all of their emissions, things like how much of it is road transportation, how much of it is marine traffic, how much of it is aviation fuel being burned. They even measure stuff like how the different ways you spread manure in different parts of the country emit different levels of methane. They do emission tests on the mouths of coal mines. And what's really odd, and I don't know why this is, there could be a very good scientific explanation. Even their historical data, if you go back and look at previous reports, their historical data on their emissions changes. It goes up, it goes down, it depends. But that's kind of strange. But you can do a really cool deep dive on it. I encourage anybody, go to the UN website and look up Canada emissions reports, and you can read them yourselves. The point is that it's not working. The carbon taxes were supposed to reduce emissions. They weren't sold as massive money-making machines for government. They weren't sold as revenue generators. None of that was on the table. They said they would reduce emissions, period. And I want to be clear. They didn't say, per capita or per GDP, blah, blah, blah. That's goalpost moving. If you're talking about emissions, you're talking about a cumulative amount of stuff, pardon the loose term. You're talking about a cumulative amount of stuff. Our cumulative amount of stuff is going up, not down. They said it was going to go down. And the only thing that's happening is that people's wallets are being drained, and more people are having trouble affording both groceries and getting to work. And keep in mind also that this just continuously costs people in their day-to-day lives. So even if you describe yourself as a hardcore environmentalist, fine, power to you. It's not working. Even the Sierra Club of BC says this isn't working. They even called the BC carbon tax a couple of years ago a token effort. We've got the highest carbon taxes in Canada. It's 24 cents per liter of gasoline. Again, $18. If you're filling up your minivan, it's $18 extra every single time, or it's $30 extra every single time you're filling up your pickup truck. Can you afford that? If you can't, pick up the phone and call your MP and you tell them to get on this. It doesn't matter if they're liberal or conservative or NDP. You tell them this is not the way to go. And you can go to our website at taxpayer.com. We've got petitions there against both carbon taxes.
Yeah, well, it's a clear and gross policy failure, but again, it gets back to the feeling like you're going to do something. It was interesting. I had some guests on who did the documentary Bright Green Lies. Some folks at least are coming, and these guys, I know some of my listeners their heads were popping because a couple of the guests, I had a whole panel, were very, very stereotypical, very left-wing people. But so they started going into some of the social justice things, which really caused some veins to pulse. But the reality was they were also looking at alternative energy sources and things such as that, much like that Michael Moore one a while back. And they're saying, look, guys, this isn't working. This stuff isn't actually better than what we're trying to get rid of. It's not an improvement. And I enjoyed seeing that, even if we were very politically, different from each other. At least they were looking at it saying, this is what I want to achieve. It didn't achieve it, so we have to do something different. And that is what people have to start saying left, right, and center on these carbon taxes. If it's not going to achieve a reduction in emissions, there's just no point.
Exactly. What are we doing then? And this is why the data is very important. And so, like, math is math. Numbers are numbers. Go take a look at them. And I would encourage anybody to do so. If your emissions keep going up, that means it's not working, because you told us it was going to reduce emissions and this was all about global emissions and the environment. So that's not working. So we have to do something else. So this is why we need to scrap both of these carbon taxes, because it's not helping the environment anyway, and it's just costing us more and more money. And just think, if folks had that money in their pockets, they'd be able to perhaps afford a car that was more energy efficient. Maybe they'd be able to afford insulation to better help their homes. But frankly, most people I know, I don't know about you, they try their very best anyway, even with the money they do have. I don't know anybody who just grabs a barrel of oil and burns it in their backyard for fun. Like, people don't do that. People are usually quite energy conscious and they're quite environmentally conscious. Canadians generally are very much so on both fronts, but it's not working and it's costing us a ton of dough. So stop doing this. The definition of insanity is doing something over and over again and expecting a different result. Well, we need to stop being insane.
Yeah, well, you're right. Most people want to do what they feel is the right thing, but they're getting bad leadership sometimes. And I'll finish with an analogy. One of my favorites of something that's happened in Calgary, and I think it's still happening. We brought in, every city's doing it, the blue bins, the green bins, the brown bins, the rainbow bins. I don't know. There's so many bins now, I can barely keep track anymore what I'm supposed to separate. But they began with the recycling. And they said, no, put everything into the one bin. We'll keep it simple. And we're going to have people paid. We're going to go and sort all this, and they're going to recycle it. And again, they're going to save all the fluffy bunnies. And we put all our jam jars and everything into that. The glass was the main one. It all went in there. And it was like years into it. And it came out that, okay, they've been washing it and separating it and sorting it and crushing it into this powder, but nobody wants it. And they've got this mountain of glass. They had a mountain at the Calgary City dump of this powdered glass. Like, it was thousands of tons of this stuff because they didn't know what else to do with it. They've separated it. They've cleaned it, but there's actually no market for it. And I wrote a piece on it because it just floored me. And this was bureaucracy at its best. They came up with this paper and said, we figured it out. We could take it, since it's already at the landfill, and this is being smart, and we can use it for filling the roads before we build them to get around the landfill. So in other words, you're going to bury it at the landfill. Why didn't we just throw it in the garbage in the first place?
Sorry for laughing, but you got to laugh or cry sometimes.
Yeah, I know. But that's the truth of it. And you know what? It's not, I don't want to get on the case of the people who took the labels off their jars and rinsed them out and separated them and put them in those bins. They really thought they were doing a better thing. Realistically, there was more energy burned because they had to be washed, they had to be crushed and all of that. And in the
stored.
End, they still ended up just having to be buried anyways. We would have actually done more for the planet by just sticking it straight underground to begin with. But again, the feeling for feeling green is sometimes more important than being green. Hopefully we can change a bit of that, because people mean well. And if they can get the right means in front of them, they will do the right thing for the most part. So the carbon tax isn't the right means. So let's get rid of that and move on to more productive means. So thank you guys at the Taxpayers Federation so much for keeping to point these things out. And we'll keep pushing those reality checks. And I think eventually we'll get better government. It's just a matter of how broke we got to get first.
Thank you so much. We'll keep trying to use facts to change people's feelings.
Great. Thanks, Kris. And you're at taxpayer.com, is it?
You betcha.
All right. I'm sure we'll be chatting again sometime soon.
Take care.
Thanks. Okay, as I said before, I always love getting the taxpayer folks on. I got Kris to give that BC perspective. Franco's been on quite regularly. Terrazano, he's actually taken it on himself. He's going to be heading to Ottawa. He's the federal director now. I'm sure we'll still be talking to him. He'll have bigger issues to take on. And boy, there's a sacrifice. Having to leave the West to get over there to expose things in Ottawa. Ottawa is actually a beautiful city, but look at all those bureaucrats and weenies he's going to have to deal with. He's going to be earning every dollar he does, that's for sure. Just to go through a couple comments. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't catch this one, Peter, before Kris was gone, but if your average family of four is owing $250,000 debt by 2024 plus $75,000 for provincial debt, I can't confirm that. Sorry, I should have grabbed Kris before that got here, but it sounds about right. And it's only growing. The debt load is just insane. The private debt load is another frightening area, actually, with businesses, things such as that are taking on. Lee just put a message. He's in the waiting room there. Go to the debtclock.ca to find out. Yeah, and you can kind of break it down and break down your provincial things. That's another one of the great things that the Taxpayers Federation has done for us, is showing those debt load that we're taking on, because I think people don't imagine, they just don't understand how massive that debt that we're sitting on is. So Lee, now I mentioned at the top of the show, those who weren't there at that point, I'm gonna find this. He has been, where are we? Aha, there we go. Fined $2,800 for reporting on Regina's Freedom Rally. Yes, apparently, it is illegal for the press to report on anti-lockdown protest rallies, discussions, things such as that. You got swept up in the works. So I'm bringing on the now criminal Lee Harding. Thanks very much for joining me, Lee. It's an interesting story there.
Thank you for the best intro ever. The now criminal Lee Harding. Best ever.
I should put a caveat. You haven't been convicted yet.
Well, no, not yet. No. Well, mind you, we're in an environment now where you're pretty much guilty until proven innocent instead of the other way around. That's why I think a lot of these people were out here, was they were seeing an end to our basic freedoms on the horizon. And that's worth covering. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I mean, people need to push back. I mean, that's why every modern charter of rights, constitution, those sorts of things that every developed country has, there's a number of things that are essential freedoms that are always packed into those. Expression, association, speech, these things are all critical, and they're all being pushed and pushed back on and crushed a bit with these pandemic restrictions. They're using Section 1 of the Charter as a justification to kind of set these rights aside right now. I think we're going to be discussing for a lot of years on whether they were justified in doing so. But another one is free press. So how did you get swept up in the bunch when you were just there to cover it, rather than, I imagine you weren't standing on the stage, waving a sign and giving speeches or anything?
No. Who knows? They might have me on stage if there's a next time, just to tell the story of how far things are getting. But no, I wasn't there to do that at all. And I haven't been a groupie for these things. I mean, they've had rallies almost weekly for months and months. I went to one casually last summer. My friend said, "Hey, you want to go see it?" Sure, let's see what's happening. Well, there was more people that particular day in the summer who were celebrating Mohammed's grandson and acknowledging him in his principles and whatnot at the legislature steps that day. I went when Chris Sky was there. I wrote an article on that, and this was a very good opportunity to talk to some people at this particular rally, because Maxime Bernier was there, Laura Lynn Tyler Thompson was there, Art Pulowski was supposed to be there, and he got arrested on the highway there before he could get over. And Mark Friesen, who is a PPC candidate and who has a YouTube channel in his own right, and there were some others. And I mean, what better opportunity? So that's why I was there. And what happened was, I was following the entourage of speakers out to their vehicle where they were going to go to the next event. So I was still asking questions, talking to them in the parking lot. Okay, it's time to go. And then the police showed up and gave them tickets. And Laura Lynn gave the police officer writing her up a little lesson on some other ways to treat Corona and why this was overblown. I don't know if he was listening or not. He, at the end of it, said, "I was surprised you got that out. It was almost in one breath." then Bernier said, I'm happy to get this ticket. I'm fighting for Canada, and I'm going to put this in my office wall. So he did that. And then I said, I'm a member of the press. Are you going to ticket me as well? And I said, well, you might not want to go back to the park there, on your way home. Well, I was walking by the park, and then I heard a rapper from the stage, and I used to freestyle and battle and all that kind of stuff. And this is someone I wanted to talk to. So when the performance was done, I went back. I made sure I didn't miss him, talked to him for an interview. We got him on the walkway out for a picture. We were walking out of the park, and that's when the police arrested him. Well, not arrested, but ticketed him and myself. And he was quite happy to get a ticket. He was a martyr for the cause. And of course, it never hurt a rapper to be in an altercation with the police. I mean, that sounds like street cred to me. So he was of a different attitude to that. I was not looking to get a ticket. I was not looking to be a martyr for the cause. And I think $2,800 hurts just about everybody but Bill Gates. But it's not like I'm flush with cash either. And so, I didn't really need that. But it's a sign of the times. I mean, the policeman, I said, no, I'm here doing interviews. That's why I'm here. And he says, well, can you show me your press credentials? Well, do you think an illegal event issues press credentials? No. So I showed him my portfolio for Western Standard and for another organization that I write for. And he says, why weren't you wearing your mask? Why weren't you social distancing? Well, that's completely irrelevant to an outdoor gathering. I mean, it's the 11th person makes everyone liable to a $10,000 fine. So anyway, he wrote me up, and the maximum fine has been increased to $10,000, but they have not used any of those $10,000 fines yet. This whole thing is so political. What's remarkable was, in advance of this very important rally, they increased the fines from $2,800 to $10,000, the maximum fines. And then I did a story for Western Standard on Saskatchewan's Queen of Fines, which is Tamara Lavoie. And she says, I don't care what these fines are, whether they're $2,800, $10,000, they're illegal, and they're not going to stop me. So then I think they decided, well, let's not make any martyrs of people by actually using this $10,000 fine. And while this rally was going on a Saturday afternoon, that's when the premier decided that they were going to announce that the public gathering limits were going to be 150 instead of just 10. So at the same time, they're saying, well, in 3 weeks, 150 will be fine, but today, the 11th one is criminal. They're announcing this. This is a very political endeavor that's going on here. This is not about medicine. It's not about science. And to see the JCCF in this last week bring forward some very damning evidence about the PCR tests is very significant too, because they've been cycling them at 40, and there's still a substantial amount of errors even at a lower amount. And the PCR test founder, when he was still alive, he said, they're misusing my test. And he also had some very damning words about Anthony Fauci. And he says, these people have their own agenda. They make up their own rules as they go. And he says, it's not the agenda that we would want, given that our tax dollars in some way go to them to pay for our health. So there's lots rotten in the state of Denmark, as they might say.
Yeah, well, in Saskatchewan's numbers, you're not in as dire a condition as Alberta's been lately, and Alberta has actually plateaued and seems to be stabilizing. Thankfully, the deaths are way, way down, and we're seeing that everywhere. That's a separate debate as to why and things such as that. But so, I mean, the crackdowns, it seem excessively harsh out there when you guys really haven't had as much of a problem with the infections on the go anyways.
Yeah, it's all about crushing a movement, really. And it really surprises me. I mean, the first reports in the Leader Post about this gathering, there were very few people. There were 16 people who were gathered. Really? Well, it said there were 16 people who were ticketed, and they showed a picture that, from the way it was framed, looked like there was not that many people there. Well, we gave coverage to it and showed that there were hundreds, and showed the fact that the Leader Post had lied in one of my commentaries on this. And in the one sense, I've heard them estimate, there's about 200 there. I think there was more than that. I know Bernier thought there was more like 500 there. So there's, they're trying to say that this is a small group of people, that this is fringe. And then the way that it's being covered, really cast these people as kooks. I mean, this morning, the article I wrote on Nathan Lynchuk, which again would not have even happened if I hadn't gone to this event, the Saskatoon policeman who basically left the force over this because, oh my gosh, he took his children to a children's rally, a freedom rally, where there was, oh no, a clown and bubbles and a hula hoop. And the mayor's calling this, insane super spreader event, blah, blah, blah. And, Lynchuk is looking at it going, if you're going to chastise me for bringing my kids to an event in the park, I'm out. You're not going to have a hearing and cast me as the bad guy. Why did you do this? And plus, he says, if I've got my fellow cops that are taking pictures of me, handing them into my bosses, not talking to me first and whatnot, and then doing that, he says, trust is a lot as being a policeman. And when you don't have trust in your fellow officers or the trust of your fellow officers, it's already over. So he was a person of principle. He says, I can't look my kids in the eye because he says we could have communism here in a few years or sooner. And when they look at me and say, Dad, why didn't you do something? So, he's not looking for fame either. He says, I'm not a gifted public speaker. He said, I'm uncomfortable doing these things. But he says somebody has to stand up. But you look in the media, in the mainstream media, and he's basically being cast as a kook. Oh my gosh, one of those people thought, whatever. But never framed in a way where, you can fully appreciate what it is and why he's doing it. So I shouldn't say that. I think there was a time later, about a week later, or 2 weeks after his resignation, where they did try to give him some air. But I think there's this consciousness in the back of the mainstream media mind that, if it ever ends up being that this article is enough to actually sway someone from not being a skeptic to being someone who's sympathetic to one of these protesters, well, maybe that's going too far. So, there's always a limit as to how they will frame something, how they will look at it. And so I think we really need a discerning public. And unfortunately, it's almost like the They Live movie where in 1988 or around there, where Rowdy Roddy Piper, he has these glasses, and with these glasses, he can see through the signal that is blinding people. And so he's seeing reality through a whole new lens. And so he's begging these people, put on the glasses, and his friend won't do it. And he thinks, his friend's a murderer. And so they have this fight, and basically he forces these glasses on him where a person can finally see. And I find with so many issues around this, it's like that, whether it's risks of the vaccines, whether it's just social distancing and whatnot. And I see these people that are otherwise intelligent posting, why don't people just listen to the science? It's so clear. Our authorities are clear. Well, our authorities might be all singing from the same hymn book, but that doesn't mean that it's the right tune.
No, and we've turned people against each other, and that's one of the most distressing things at all. The mobbing, the shaming. An event, I'm more afraid of clowns than I would be of the COVID at such a thing, particularly if we want to follow the science, if there's anybody who's at very, very, very little risk of transmission or attaining or getting harm from COVID, it's children. We should be thankful for that. As far as bugs go, I mean, if there's anything we want to save, it's our children. So we've been fortunate in that sense, and we need to cover these events. I mean, super spreader, there's a term they love throwing out there all the time. Well, we were at the rodeo almost 2 weeks ago tomorrow. Well, 2 weeks ago tomorrow. Everybody's been saying, wait 2 weeks, wait 2 weeks. Well, Dave Naylor has been in touch with Alberta Health Services, and the amount of cases from our super spreader event remains at 0. It's a goose egg, not a single one. We're contact tracing. People are out there. They're looking. Look, if that rodeo was going to spread it, we would have known it by now. It didn't happen. It didn't happen when Houston had a baseball game. It didn't happen when the Super Bowl happened. It didn't happen when people got together at Sylvan Lake in Alberta. But what we do see happening, we had that, you might have seen it in the Standard, a student from Olds College, it was found that she was at the rodeo and they were actually threatening her ability to finish her classes. Thankfully, that turned around when the Western Standard reported on it. We saw a couple of nurses that, again, social media police, self-appointed police folks, outed them and reported them to Alberta Health Service, saying these are people who attended a rodeo. They've been put at risk. They should be fired. They should be quarantined. They should be shot. They should be skinned, whatever else. It depends on which hysteric lunatic you're listening to online who is pushing these things. But we've really turned ourselves into this mob that we're at each other's throats. I mean, and the state is feeding that, and it's really distressing. And that's why we need press to report on these events, to show they aren't dangerous, they aren't killing people, they aren't necessarily that insane. I mean, there's a handful of lunatics, there always will be, but for the most part, they're just concerned people. And when you're charging press for reporting on that, that's a really scary precedent.
Oh, I agree with that. I think this is new territory. And when you look at what they did to Rebel News, I mean, where they're renting a houseboat from Airbnb for the reporters out there in mid-April, and there are 50 police that are surrounding this houseboat and not letting anyone in or out, and then arresting David Menzies and saying, well, we'll release him if you let us go through your stuff. That's just a whole new level. And we knew that Montreal was a city of corruption, but this is the next level. And I don't know, it's a sign of the times, really. So, Lynchuk gets it. He's like, look, if we keep going the direction we're going, where are we going to end up? And if anyone thinks this is still about the disease, I encourage them to think a lot more broadly than that, because it's a lot like climate change. I mean, we just heard a bunch of facts where none of the things are really working, the measures that they're doing. The measures are a big pretense. It's ending up in the dump. So what is this, all of this about in the environmental movement? Is it really actually about the environment, or is the environment a specific means to an end to get certain kind of regulations and controls, a mentality of scarcity, etc., into the public mind? So, yeah, I mean, people need to wake up and open their eyes a bit, and really, a lot of people who are concerned say, well, how can we stop this? And I do think that's a very important question, and I think that's the selfless question. But I think there's other ways that we need to start looking at this, and that is, if Canada is going to head on this road and we can't stop it, is it time to move? Is it time to leave Canada, like some of the Mennonites did when they could see the Bolshevik Revolution and where it was going to end up, and they came to Canada generations ago, or like Art Pawlowski says, well, I came in 1995 and they promised freedom here, and it's not looking like that right now. And I know where this can end up because I've seen it. I grew up in it. So, yeah, I mean, it is concerning. I think one thing people can do, because the food prices have gone up, and I don't think we've seen the end of that, is if you are any non-perishable food that you want, you should be buying it right now. Because if there's 10 or 12% increase in inflation by the end of the year, well, you just save yourself 10%. At the best, at the worst case scenario and the best benefit, it's going to be hard to get out there, and there'll be food shortages. But at the worst, you save yourself 10%. Yeah, you got some shelf space that all got taken up with some cans of food, but you're going to eat it. So I think there's certain things that people can do right now to prepare for worst case scenarios. But it's certainly time to speak up. And I think people need to, when they're looking at things, stop Googling them and start looking them up on DuckDuckGo. There was one video where you can take it or leave it, but Dr. Sherry Tenpenny talked about 8 ways the mRNA vax can kill you. I don't know if it's going to kill you. It could be bad for immunity instead of better. But if you look that up on Google, you can't even find it. And if you look it up on DuckDuckGo, you can see a whole screen full of that video exactly as it is. So people are being protected, quote unquote, from certain information. And the only information we see about these doctors is that they're quacks and kooks, except we see that they're not. They're actually well qualified. They have a different opinion, but they've become the heretics. They've become the Galileos, the Copernicuses of our time, where there's a church of sorts that doesn't want that opinion out there, and they will persecute and brand as a heretic and burn at the stake almost, if they could, anyone who has a different opinion.
Well, let's pivot a bit. Actually, I'll get to one of your other stories, since you're talking about that and cost of living and how it's going to go up. So I was talking again with Kris Sims of the Taxpayers Federation earlier, and part of what they were pointing out was how carbon taxes aren't actually reducing emissions. So again, it's just a tax grab. They're not actually having any impact. You wrote recently, though, on as well, carbon taxes and the impact on agricultural producers, because it's an area people are thinking about when they're filling up to go to the soccer game or something, but they're forgetting these get applied all over the place. And that trickles all the way down to you as a consumer, no matter which way you go about it. And it's really putting pressure on our ag community. Can you expand a bit on your article there?
Well, there's a few things going on there. Yes, I mean, there are signs, first of all, with the initial thing here that the prices are going up. Now, when we saw the the thing that was happening in 2008 when there was a massive injection of government money, it didn't really trickle into the economy because for various reasons. And the Bank of Canada wound that down quite quickly to get its balance sheets back to normal. Well, this time around, we're not seeing that. We're already seeing the early signs of inflation. And the debate amongst economists is really, when is it going to hit? And that's another reason to, again, spend, except maybe on lumber right now because it's a crazy price. But if you know you're going to spend it in the next year, you better spend it now. Now, with regards to the carbon tax on agricultural matters, yeah, I mean, it's going to be another thing that drives up the cost. And talking to Trevor Tombe or other economists about this, the fact that you have a carbon tax, even if they rebate it all back, let alone do Aaron O'Toole's dumb idea of a points program, but even if you rebate it all back, it does affect the economy. And so agricultural producers have very large input costs. It costs a lot to put in gas or diesel in your tractor. And they have lots of input costs with greenhouses for those who are using them, and other ways that even with feed and whatnot, it costs. So they are, as a producer, absorbing a lot of these consumption taxes on carbon, basically. So yeah, I mean, it's a concern for them, and they are trying to exempt in any way that they can through the Agriculture Carbon Alliance. They are trying to lobby the government to acknowledge the carbon sinks that are in their land, which the government is doing for the ones since 2017. But again, the more conscientious or maybe foreseeing farmers that did it before then, they're not getting any credit for it, so they want it. There is a conservative bill that's going to exempt some of that if it passes, but they want to see exemptions from carbon tax even further, not just on their fuel, but on other input costs. So, I mean, good luck to them. One of the problems that John Robson has seen, who's the history professor at Augustine College, but also has a forum for talking about climate change, he says, as soon as you concede the argument on climate change, you really have conceded the carbon tax. As soon as you say it's this man-made contribution that is the crucial and major factor in worldwide ecology and climate change, then he says, it's very hard to have the moral argument against a carbon tax. And he says the fact that neither the conservatives nor most groups are willing to debate in that, which, again, part of the reason they don't is there is this sort of a conformist kind of almost religious belief that this is man-made climate change. And again, if you say anything or present any evidence contrary to that, the cancel culture says you shouldn't. So you can't even make that argument. So, of course, if you have arguments you can't make, you have conclusions you can't refute because you're not allowed to. So, yeah, I mean, it's a problem. And one of the things that I did, I'm also a research associate for the Frontier Center of Public Policy. And last year, I looked at everything that Tides Foundation is funding. And it's pretty stark when you look at this, because it's not just oil and gas and pipelines. It's every aspect of the research of the resource sector, including forestry and agriculture. So this is going to hamper everything that Canada produces, and we are a resource-based economy. So if you wipe that out, I'm not sure what you have left. You have a service economy, and you might have some high tech, but it's not like we keep all the brightest minds either. And with the math curriculum the way it is in some of these provinces, I don't even know if our kids are going to be able to add 2 + 2.
Yeah, well, and we're heading into, there's no doubt about it. I mean, we're in hard times. We're heading for harder times. I mean, we've put everything on the credit cards to get through this year. It's going to lead to inflation. It's going to lead to other challenges. I mean, a great number of businesses have gone out of business and they won't be coming back. Something I'm exploring more, but a large number of businesses that are open right now, they're hanging in there only because of the current subsidies. They're getting wage subsidies, they're getting rent subsidies. But when that comes to an end, they're shuttering their doors too. So we're going to have unemployment. We're going to have closed businesses, massive government debt, inflation. I know I'm just sounding like the apocalypse is coming, but this is scary stuff. And we got to pay attention. And so we should be looking to what can we do domestically to keep that cost of living down while we recover? What can we do to make it affordable? And of course, energy ties into everything. So I'm tying into, you'd written recently on Line 5, and now Gretchen Whitmer, speaking of lunatic environmentalists, the governor of Michigan, she looks very dedicated to shutting that line down by any means. The environmentalists are starting to line up behind her. They're starting to find native activists to put at the front of the line. It's turned into a battleground. You wrote recently on the impacts of a Line 5 shutdown, and it's going to impact a lot of us. I mean, east and west. Some people are kind of looking forward to it in a sense. I got to admit, I've said a little bit of it just for a reality check. Guys, this is what happens when you shut down your domestic ability, because that's what we're doing. But all the same, it's going to have a very big impact on a lot of people. And you wrote on that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh, well, yeah. It was interesting talking to Dan McTeague, the former Liberal MP who's now in charge of Canadians for Affordable Energy, which he founded. He said, I have been trying to warn people about this for years. And he says, nobody wanted to pay attention to me until just recently at the 11th hour when we could lose everything. Oh, is this a public issue? Yes, it is. He says, if we'd have had Energy East approved, it wouldn't have been so bad. They'd be much closer by now. Actually, if it had been approved in the early stages, it would have been done by now. But he says, if we had that, we wouldn't have all our eggs in one basket. But as it is, you've got a 45% loss to Ontario's fuel supply and its refinery supply if Line 5 gets shut down. And also for Quebec, it's about the same numbers. Line 5 feeds into Line 9, which goes to Quebec. And some of the Western independence people like Barry Cooper, who I enjoy talking to at the University of Calgary, he says, the worse damages does the better in a perverse way for the East to understand the West's pain when it just keeps shutting down pipelines, because you can have this imaginary economy where you don't need any fossil fuels and pipelines are bad and oil is bad. But as soon as you see the prices triple, which some analysts say could actually happen if Line 5 was shut down, as soon as that happens, boy, they're going to really, really be missing that fossil fuel and realize that they cannot live without it. And maybe they should not have been so smug. But this is bad for Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, because Line 5 provides a lot for them as well. It takes a lot of the Western oil, mostly from us actually, and then it'll start out at the western edge of the Great Lakes, and then it heads through mostly under the ground, but there's about a 4-mile stretch where it goes through the Strait of Mackinac, and then it comes out. So they want to eventually put this in a concrete corridor. So they're still working on that. But in the meantime, Whitmer wants to shut it down. And the latest thing she did just on Wednesday was to say, well, if this continues, as far as we're concerned, it's illegal now. And we will just basically take away all revenue from Enbridge from any money it makes from now on. So this is somebody who is basically putting the poison pill to their own economy without good reason. And there hasn't been, there was a couple times where anchors and different things hit this pipeline in 2018 and 2019, didn't cause any harm, but she's very alarmist and she's disturbing. This is the same woman who a year ago banned seeds from being sold in stores because of Corona, so you couldn't plant your garden. So people don't like her. And again, she's not for the people. And we're seeing far too much of this, as there are people in government right now, whether they're in Calgary, whether they're in Ottawa, whether they're in Lansing, Michigan, or wherever their capital is, that are not for the people. And so what are the people going to do? Just sit and take it?
Well, yeah, and a lot of this is based on a lie. And the thing is, one has to look at somebody like Gretchen Whitmer, and there's a lot of Gretchen Whitmers out there, but she's an ideologue. And unfortunately, with an ideologue, you can't reason with them. And, the lie that's being exposed is that, as you pointed out, there's been a couple of anchor strikes. It got people concerned. Okay, fair enough. It is a concern. You wouldn't want something that moves 500,000 barrels of fuel a day to suddenly start leaking into the Great Lakes. So let's address this. And Enbridge did. They said, we are going to case it in concrete. We're going to upgrade it. This thing ran safely for nearly 70 years. But you know what? There's a risk presenting itself, and we are going to tunnel and change that so that risk doesn't present itself. Now, Whitmer knows this. But the problem she has, the reality, and again, this gets back to the lie and the idealism, is that if they do that, then that pipe will run for another 50 to 70 years. And that's what she doesn't want. It's that anti-petroleum fanaticism that we just have to shut down this infrastructure using any excuse and means possible. And then somehow, unicorn piss will appear and we will be able to power our homes on it. But, that's where the problem is. And that's where this standoff is. And I don't see... people are saying it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Well, I don't see where the intervention is going to come from to change it. Maybe the American courts will step up, but Biden's obviously staying way the hell out of this one. So what might save people from this?
Boy, I don't know. Save yourself. or call out on God to save you. I mean, whatever it is, it's not going to be the politicians. I think that it needs to be the people. And, it's interesting. Sometimes you see some cues for the future in some science fiction shows. I've been looking at some of the old episodes of The Outer Limits, and there was this person who was bred in a government facility in the future in a hatchery and was a soldier all of his life, and somehow he went through some anomaly and time traveled back to the past, and so he's learning English better, and he's asking, what is government? What is this? And he said, this is the people who make decisions for us because we let them. Okay, so I thought, wow, now there's some social commentary from 1964 that still applies. This is scary. We've had a good run in the West for a long time. We haven't had wars on our shores. We've had democracy and whatnot. But I think we need to start looking at the scenarios that happened in Nazi Germany. And people could be saying, people like me, okay, you're on the wrong side of history. Well, if you're in 1933, you're on the wrong side of history. But in 1946, you're looking pretty good. And I remember reading, actually hearing an interview, and it was called Blind Spot, and it was to Hitler's secretary. She was just taken from a clerical pool in towards the end of the war, 1944 or so. And so she was up close with Hitler, really had no idea what the Nazis were about. And so she recounted in this interview some of her observations and what was happening at the end in the bunker and kind of the dire mood as the bombs got closer. She said after the war, she saw a memorial to somebody who spoke out against the Nazis, a young woman who paid the price for it. And she looked at that and she's like, wow, this girl was my age and somehow she saw it. And why didn't I? And she was right there as Hitler's secretary. And as a woman who was 80 at this interview, she said, I am just now beginning to forgive myself. So, there's the opportunity for people watching this to see. And I encourage them to look deeper. I really hate the fact that the Saskatchewan government is holding our own children hostage and saying, if you vaccinate 70% of them with the COVID shot, well, then we can open things up again. So they are making these people's political pawns. And I've got teenage daughters that this is going to affect if they choose to get this vaccine. And I don't really, have the final say in the situation. So I'm concerned for them. And really, when you look at the infection rates for kids, they should not be getting a vaccine that we have developed in record time, a fraction of the record time of any previous vaccine, which is not even actually a vaccine in the traditional sense. They're not working by the methodology of having a weak version of a COVID virus because it's kind of weak as it is anyway. They're using a completely different kind of methodology. And we're seeing some disturbing side effects in the short term and some in the long term, even by people who've been close to people with the vaccine. Now, this may sound weird if you've never heard it, but there's even people whose menstrual cycles, if they've been near someone with the vaccine, it's all going wonky. We're seeing postmenopausal and prepubescent girls that are having vaginal bleeding that are because of their proximity to someone with the vaccine. But all of these kinds of otherwise normally very disturbing, would be made public kind of things, they're being suppressed because it might be causing vaccine hesitancy. And the doctors that speak out about it are getting chastised and threatened with losing their license and silence and this kind of thing. This is communist East Germany kind of tactics. This is terrible.
Yeah, and to get back to, and as you said, I don't think there's anybody as motivated or as horrible in the background as Hitler at this point, but the principles are the same and the problem. And as you pointed out with your analogy, I mean, things were almost easier for lunatics like him and sick buggers to pull off what he did. Your average German on the ground did not really actually know what was going on in those outside areas. They're human. They would have been mortified to realize there was such mass extermination. I mean, there were issues going on. That's a whole separate show and discussion. But what it gets to is the importance of free flow of information and communication among people. We are at one of the most empowered times. Well, we are at the most empowered time of human history for information. I mean, the government is trying its hardest through C10 and through other things to stem the flow of information. And I mean, hey, vaccine concerns, other things, there's debates to be had. Some are right and some are wrong, but the only way to do it is through communication. Stifling the voices doesn't aid any of us. We need to keep those communication lines full. And it's distressing to see that the government feels the better way to deal with this is to step on individual rights rather than try and bring it in the open then and make your case. If you're right, make your case and let's debate it.
Oh, absolutely. one of the interesting things that when you look deeper at the whole Nazi phenomenon is that when the Cold War ended, those Nazi scientists, well, some of them, they're completely unaccounted for. Some of them went into the United States in Operation Paperclip, and the others went into Russia, and they just kept on going. And so the research that they gained and that some of the mentality has seeped into some things. But when I went to Yad Vashem, and if viewers go to fcpp.org and read Lessons I Learned from Yad Vashem, when I went there in 2009, and this is the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, I had some very deep impressions from talking to the tour guide who was there. And I mean, first of all, when the Jews started to be exterminated, even the Jews, they heard rumors of it, but they couldn't believe it themselves. They could not believe that people in Poland or wherever else would be doing this to them, or this be happening in Treblinka, would be happening in these other places. And they actually had to send someone to find out, really, an emissary. And after that, eventually, even though they were half starved by then, they finally decided to break out of the Warsaw Ghetto and found out that they could. And when you think also of, even when you look at The Sound of Music, I mean, there's a part in there where she says, well, how did you know my dad was on vacation? He says, well, we make it our business to know everything about everybody. Well, this was the very same thing that Brzezinski he predicted in 1971. He said that the authorities the technology will be there for the authorities to know even people's personal habits. And I mean, this is our cell phones. Every app goes out. The app is listening all the time because so you can talk to it to tell it where you should be driving, or Siri, what about blah blah blah, and then it'll tell you something. Or if you get on louder with Crowther, you ask it who Jesus Christ was, and he'll tell you he was a fictional character, and you ask it who Muhammad was, and they'll give you a biography. So I mean, some of these things are happening, but she says, remember, she says, this is the tour guide in Yad Vashem. She says, remember, all of this happened in a democracy. Right. So if you think that Canada is all great and everything, I mean, Germany was very cultured, but it had economic desperation because of World War I and the reparations put on it. And that economic desperation led to a Hitler. So if we have economic desperation imposed on us in Canada, and you have people thinking that government tracing and contact tracing and knowing everyone who's related to everyone and everywhere they go, all of a sudden this becomes advantageous somehow. Well, you add economic desperation to that, and we can have our own Hitler. And I wouldn't call Trudeau a Hitler, but as far as this Liberal government is listening to the people, it might as well be a dictatorship because they don't care about us out here. That's for sure.
No, we've been spoiled, and we always presume that the government's benevolent. And it's because, for the most part, that's what we've had. But we can't forget that there are people who will take that authority, that ability, those powers, and they will use them for ends that aren't in the interest of the people on the ground. It's a concept that's being lost. That came back with talking actually a bit with Kris Sims. We've given up personal responsibility. We want the government to do everything for us. Anytime we got a problem, we ask the government to take care of it. In fact, anytime we got a problem, if the government doesn't take care of it, we blame them for it. I mean, some of it, we're telling them to control us. We're telling them to run our lives. And we're voluntarily giving away the ability to speak up for ourselves. As you said, Siri is there. It's listening to us. It's sharing that data. But you know what? There was no gun to our head. We bought it. We set it up. We did it. We, gave up our right to that privacy. Every time we ask the government, you're responsible for my healthcare, you're responsible for my financial well-being, you're responsible for the climate, well, you're empowering them, and you're taking all the responsibility away from them yourself. And that's a problem we have as a society. And again, my only hope is that's why I get most worked up when it comes to the freedoms is when they try to control information, though. That's the only way we can get ourselves out, is if we can communicate, share the experiences, share the happenings, report on them, as you did reporting. And that's where it's so disturbing to see you fined for reporting on an incident. And, and people getting shut down, screamed at, canceled for putting out different points of view. No, throw it all into the mix. We've got a lot of smart people. We've got a lot of discussion. We've got a little discourse. And most often, not always, but most often the best answers will come out in the end rather than trying to control it. And control is a scary thing.
Well, it is, one of my friends who's otherwise intelligent, he said this a few months ago. He says, now I hate this because somebody's going to put a post on here saying that they shouldn't take the vaccines because of what some kook says, and then grandma's going to be dead and my kids are not going to be able to see their grandma because blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, whoa, okay, now wait a second here. First of all, you're banking on the fact that these people have nothing good to say because you're not listening to them either. You're not giving them the time of day and you think they should be censored. But the other thing is, what happened to people making their own decisions based on the information that they encounter? You know, because we all encounter different information. We judge whether we think that information comes from a source that knows what they're talking about, and for good reason. We assess that and then we make our own decisions. So, you know, when you control the flow of information, you're starting to control the thoughts of the people, just to leave them the illusion of having a fully informed and reasoned choice when they don't have it anymore. I mean, this was the thing. If you read, I always encourage people to read Edward Bernays' 1928 book, Propaganda, and you can find it on the website historyisaweapon.org. But he basically says there, back in the day, when public relations, and he's the father of public relations, but it's in a very infant form back then. And he says the invisible government of the world is basically people who control the minds of people. Now, he was hinting at it, but he wasn't really saying this as a council of people in the room or anything. But he says the propagandists control the world. So the people that make things cool so that we buy them, the people that put the ideas out, they're the ones really controlling things. And he said even the people that we elect by popular demand, it's only because you've had a big campaign to make them that way. He was part of the Creel Commission that got America into World War I. Woodrow Wilson campaigned on the fact that he kept America out of the war in 1916, and then he put America into the war. He put propaganda to work. Censoring the mailing at the post office of the anti-war groups was part of the way of doing it. So here you have a government institution that's used as a mandate of censorship, and people don't even know it. And then all of a sudden, the people are demanding that America enter World War I, even though they just elected someone on the premise that he didn't, you know, and all this goes on. So he said, we realized as governments, they realized that they could propagandize people to some extent against their own will and make them move. And he was Freud's nephew, and he said, we can use the basic human motivations on a mass social scale and use those currents to our advantages. And if you look at some of the things Bernays did, the fact that we eat bacon and eggs for breakfast in the morning is because he had a campaign and he used a poll of doctors to get this result, to say that a hearty morning breakfast was better. He got women to smoke because he was hired by a tobacco company, and he did a few public relations events and a few kind of subtler things, even involving the fashions in Paris that would use the color of Lucky Strike cigarettes so that the logo became a cool color, and then women would want to they'd be more inclined to buy it. I mean, there was a whole bunch of subtleties and things that you never thought would be connected, that if you were to identify them, you would have to be thought of a nut job conspiracy theorist to say that they had anything to do with it. But he propagandized the people and even led a revolution in one of the countries that had taken away some of the interests of Alan Dulles and his brother, who had investments in this company and were losing because of what the new government was doing. And I mean, I encourage people to look at that. There's some good YouTube videos on it. There's the propaganda book, and the same thing is happening today. And this is a really interesting thing, and I know this is a bit of an aside, but I think it's important, is that what Bernays said is, he says, we could imagine some people who were making the best decisions, that were experts in every field, but the people wouldn't have it because they insist on this thing called democracy. So he says that's where propaganda comes in. So his whole premise is, we make the people do what we want them to do by propaganda, making them believe it's their own idea. And this is so, you know, what democracy has become is, it's almost like when you have the kid that is maybe 5 years old, he doesn't know how to play the video game and he wants to, and you hand him a joystick that doesn't do anything, and you say, hey, you're playing too now. And they're like, and once in a while they'll go, I don't think I'm doing anything. No, you're doing great. You're playing great. And you just let him think he's doing something. So, you know, the propaganda is at a high level right now. We have through Google search engines and different techniques that they do, we're more inclined to pick the first thing on the screen and say, whatever our search engine said, that's probably the article I should read. And this has been proven many times through many different studies. So we are getting led, we are getting herded, and then once in a while you get a sheep that wants to run out and say that I don't want to be shepherded in this way. I don't even think these shepherds are doing anything but leading us to the slaughter. And, you have the other sheep trying to round them up and say, no, don't leave. No, this shepherd is for our good.
Well, that's great. It's been quite a discussion, and we're getting up against the clock, and I appreciate that. And yeah, information, again, it's a double-edged sword, and it can be abused and taken against us by the state, as you said, in subtle ways and indirect ways. And again, my view of it is the only cure for it is just more access to information, and eventually we'll figure it out. We can have different points of view and hopefully come to rational conclusions in the end, but we've got to stand up for our rights or they will be taken away from us. There's no getting around that. It happens every time. So thanks for coming on for such a great chat, and thanks for your work out in Saskatchewan, keeping us up to date on what's happening out there. I hope and look forward to hearing that you beat that $2,800 fine, because I'm certain you got better things you could do with that kind of money. Where can we find more information on what you're up to?
Well, Western Standard, you can click on my name and see everything that I wrote there. As well, I also write for Epic Times. I'm usually doing 3 articles for them a week. And as well, I write commentaries and do the occasional long research thing for Frontier Center, which is fcpp.org. I have a YouTube channel that has the logo Lee TV, but the name is Lee Harding. And boy, if you do all that, you're listening to me an awful lot.
Well, that's excellent, Lee. I'm sure we'll be talking again soon, and I'm looking forward to your future pieces.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Cory. I enjoy your show. I think it's important. And I want to say thanks to all the people that are sponsoring Western Standard. And, it makes all the difference, because the wages of a journalist are not always healthy, but they're healthy for the democracy. And it helps us so much, because we are not government-sponsored media at Western Standard. We are here because people believe in us, and because we believe that the things we're saying are things that need to be heard. And this is another thing, that democracy and media has been really consolidated. There are 90% of the media organizations in North America are controlled by 6 corporations. And so we need to have more independent media. We used to have more independent media. And that's part of the reason why we have a controlled message, is because we have a controlled media.
Right on. Thanks, Lee. And we won't be letting ourselves be controlled.
No.
Oops. Sorry, I cut him off here there. But yeah, and Lee got ahead to what I was going to get at. And we got to make the plug, and we do have to remind everybody. And thank you all who are watching. Thanks to those people who have been sponsoring us. We can use advertising on these shows. We can support local businesses through that, promote our local services, products, things like that. And people need to, subscribe. It helps us. We aren't getting tax dollars like the CBC. We aren't getting money like the print publications from the federal government. We are staying independent, and that allows us, you can bet, Lee wouldn't be allowed to even talk about those sorts of things if we were with the CBC, or if we're getting funding from the government, because editors would be saying, no, we're too afraid to go into those subjects. Let's stay away from it. Don't touch it even. We're not going to be like that. We're not interested in reporting like that and being told what we can say or what we can't say. So that makes we're still reliant. We're relying on you guys. We're relying on those subscriptions. I know some people got a little upset still over the paywall, and I know, but there are a number of means you can sign up and you get a number of free articles and publications and things like that. And if you subscribe to the newsletter, and again, the analogy I use is, we never batted an eye 15 years ago, 20 years ago on spending $15-20 a month for a newspaper subscription, and you got stuck with all those darn newspapers stacking up in your place that you had to get rid of. $10 a month for all this content you're getting from the Western Standard, breaking things like the caucus insanity of yesterday, Lee reporting from those protests in Saskatchewan that you never hear of, Nathan Gita talking out of Prince George and BC. We're really spreading out there. Linda Slobodian's writing in Manitoba. We're truly becoming a Western publication. It's because so many people have been signing up. So thank you, and thanks for supporting a free press. I'll be back on Monday. I haven't lined up my guests for it yet, but I'm certain I'll find some interesting people to talk to. If not, you'll be stuck listening to me for a while, but I'm sure I'll come up with something that maybe interested, babble about, and rant about. So thank you all very much. You all have a good weekend, and I will see you all soon. Thanks.